Hello and welcome to this video on why and how trees change leaves in autumn, or as Americans seem hellbent on calling it, fall. With just about every tree full of leaves in the northern hemisphere and every tree just about empty of leaves in the southern hemisphere now, it seems the best time for this video. You can see the most extreme outcome for your local area. The question is, what happens in the 6 to 9 months between these two scenarios? Most everybody with knowledge about trees will know that the change in leaf colour is from a lack of chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is either withdrawn or broken down by the tree and leaves the leaves without their green colour from said chlorophyll. This leads to the production of saccharides or sugars via photosynthesis decreasing, and the loss of any kind of support for the leaf. That's the specific mechanism in the leaves themselves, but not the wider and much larger trigger. So what is the trigger for trees to drop leaves, and how does it work? To start with, we're relying almost entirely on light and temperature, but for the most part it's going to be light. Between these two, they're going to trigger hormones, and these hormones lead to a, drop in leaves, rather obviously. And this message has to be sent to every leaf on the tree. And if you look at your average tree, that's a lot of leaves. As you go from summer into autumn and then eventually into winter, the days get shorter, and vice versa from winter through to summer. Strictly speaking though, the daylight, or at least sunlight duration, is the major factor for leaf drop, as the more accurate to say a lack of light and the duration for that lack of light is going to be the signal that tells the tree that it's time to begin preparing for winter. First of all, as mentioned, the tree will stop producing chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is basically the tree's version of a red blood cell, and without this, they don't create energy. This does lead to the very notable and generally quite appealing change in coloration from green through to all sorts of shades from yellow through to crimson and brown. The tree will also stop making new leaves and start trying to conserve and theoretically store as much energy as possible for winter dormancy. Different tree species will behave differently, but for the most part, they all follow roughly the same process. It's not exactly the same, but it's broadly close enough that if the tree loses its leaves throughout the year due to winter, so your deciduous species, this is what's happening. First of all, we have the coloration itself, which most people assume is just the trees being dead, or at least the leaves themselves, but that's not entirely true. First of all, it's the ultraviolet light from the sun, which is causing the chlorophyll in the leaves to break down. This is what turns those leaves brown. To an extent, chlorophyll remains in the leaves rather than all of it. Further to that, as the weather cools down, the yellow leaves would otherwise normally return to their generally typical green coloration, but because the chlorophyll has been destroyed, this is how we get those different colors. Next we have the hormones that are going to tell the leaves not only to stop making new chlorophyll, but to store what they can for now and not make new leaves. The primary hormone that the trees make is going to be called abscisic acid. This is basically a hormone that tells the leaf cells to form a layer called a separation layer at the base of the petiole. This is going to act very much similar to a tourniquet, but one that's not taken off. And as a result, the supply of sap and other nutrition into the leaf gradually reduces over time, eventually becoming no nutrition. And as a result, the leaf literally dies and falls off, much the same way, say, frostbite would lose fingers, or a tight ring for a diabetic patient would cause amputation. The effect of this, as mentioned, first of all, is literally that there is less mobility for things like water and the carbohydrates. It's essentially the result of that single hormone. That one hormone is what causes everything to happen so far, and although strictly speaking abscisic acid isn't the only factor here, it's basically the big thing for pinching off these leaves. The second effect is that, other than the fact that you are cutting off the flow of sap, you are preventing the supply of water, oxygen, and new material like CO2 to create the new material for the tree and to keep the leaves alive. Because we have the destruction of the chlorophyll through ultraviolet light, the lack of any replacement material being available, the pigmentation in the leaves from other sources is what leads to that coloration, red, orange, yellow, and brown, and just about everything else you can imagine. The continued effect on top of all this, along with, say, a gravity, wind, animals brushing against the tree, and so on, is what leads to leaves falling off. And because you had those cells multiplying to lead to the closure of any kind of openings and vascular tissue into the leaf, you don't have an open wound. This is why, although it might seem odd, it's literally something falling off like, say, dandruff for the human body, but in tree form. There is a second kind of hormone that's somewhat important in the development of this abscission layer, and these are auxins. Auxins are something we've mentioned in another video, all related to the ability of a tree to not only propagate, but propagate successfully, because this is basically the hormone that is primarily going to regulate growth in plants. Where in the previous video, we were talking about the use of auxins to increase the probability of a tree surviving, the decrease in this case is going to lead to, well, the obvious opposite effect, but specifically only in the juncture between the leaf, or the petiole in this case, and the leaf, and that abscission layer. And by decreasing the production of auxins in those areas, you basically are telling the tree, yeah, we're not keeping this, get rid of it. In order for this to happen, to some extent, we go back to that very first point we made, and that is all about duration of light. The trees track time through the amount of non-light time they're exposed to. For all intents and purposes, the longer the period between exposure to light, the more the tree knows that it needs to start preparing for weather to become really nasty for it, and mostly, basically, winter. On the other hand, the shorter the duration between it, the more the tree goes, okay, beginning to enter the next time of year, and time to start developing in the opposite direction by increasing leaves that are growing. The two sides of this coin, so to say, that being the loss of leaves and the growth of new leaves, isn't always, let's say, sensible, because it is a very basic and very rudimentary mechanism to understand that the environment is changing around the tree. As a result, it is entirely possible, and often does happen, that some trees will get, say, confused about what it is they need to do at that time of year, particularly if it's, say, being a warm period of year, where for some reason the tree thinks, okay, it's not actually winter anymore, or conversely, if you've had a cold snap and the tree thinks, oh, it's actually the middle of winter again. So trees aren't necessarily smart, but they do have a very basic and surprisingly reliable mechanism that does what it's supposed to do. It's just not very flexible when the environment does something other than what it's supposed to do. This is how trees know not just when to change leaf color, but how they drop their leaves in autumn, and to some extent, how and why. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.